They humiliated him because he was black, dragged him out of the VIP section like a criminal, mocked his presence, and laughed as he was forced into a dirty corner seat near the exit. He said nothing. He didn't fight back. But the people who shamed him had no idea who they were dealing with. What they thought was a simple act of putting a black man back in his place was actually the first move in their own downfall. This wasn't just discrimination. It was a mistake they would regret for the rest of their careers. The man they dismissed was about to flip the entire system on its head. If you're ready to witness the power of silence turning into justice, hit like, subscribe for more stories that cut deep, and drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what do you think should have happened the moment he got stopped? The Westfield Grand Theater glowed under the amber dusk, its marble foyer buzzing with the elegance of wealth. Velvet ropes guided ticket holders to their destinations: balcony, orchestra, mezzanine, and the platinum tier that led through a separate archway gilded in gold leaf. Guests in tuxedos and silk dresses moved past the ushers with practiced ease, glasses of sparkling wine in hand, their shoes clicking like applause against the stone. One usher, a man in his 40s named Brian, stood at the platinum entrance with an air of silent authority. His navy uniform was crisp, his white gloves spotless, and his demeanor just strict enough to discourage questions. Elijah Brooks approached this entrance with purposeful steps, his presence commanding yet understated. He wore a tailored suit the color of storm clouds and walked alone, holding in his hand a single ticket, platinum tier, row A, seat 1, issued through a private executive channel. The barcode was visible beneath the transparent casing of the protective slip. Brian saw him coming and instinctively stiffened. Brian didn't reach for the ticket. He simply raised a hand and gestured toward the general entrance on the far left, the one used by the standard ticket holders. Elijah paused. For a moment, he thought perhaps he had misunderstood. He offered his ticket forward, calm and composed, assuming there must have been confusion. Brian didn't take it. Instead, he asked, without any pleasantries, for Elijah's identification. Elijah, expression steady, handed over both the ticket and his ID. The usher glanced over them, scanning for some unseen flaw. His eyes narrowed as if deciphering a forgery, then muttered that there was an issue with the formatting. Elijah remained still, saying nothing, waiting for the situation to resolve. Behind him, a couple dressed in pastel formals walked up, laughing softly between themselves. Brian greeted them warmly and opened the velvet rope without hesitation. They passed without scrutiny, their tickets barely scanned. Elijah was still standing there. He checked his watch. He was early, yet the line behind him grew longer. Brian tapped at his walkie-talkie and said he needed box office confirmation. A supervisor arrived, a woman named Teresa, in heels and a headset. She carried a tablet and looked annoyed, but not at Elijah. After a quick check on the screen, she nodded and told Brian the ticket was verified and perfectly valid. She turned to Elijah and offered a short apology for the delay, claiming it was likely a sync error. Elijah nodded once, not offering any additional words. He stepped past the velvet rope and into the gilded arch, his shoes silent on the carpeted hallway. He didn't look back, but he didn't need to. He could feel the quiet stairs behind him. His seat was near the center aisle, with an unobstructed view of the stage. He sank into the plush leather quietly, adjusting his cuffs, folding his ticket into his coat. Around him, the murmur of anticipation buzzed. But he wasn't present in it. He knew what that moment had meant. It wasn't just an usher doing his job. It wasn't just a random delay. It was a scan, a judgment, a wordless statement that he didn't look like someone who belonged in that tier. He had felt it before, in restaurants, boardrooms, hotels. But here, tonight, it carried an edge. He had built a life that should have insulated him from this kind of friction, yet the insulation kept wearing thin. The assumption was always the same. His presence was the anomaly. And tonight, the performance hadn't even started. Yet he had already been cast into a role he hadn't asked for. Still, he breathed through it, composed himself. The stage lights dimmed. The audience hushed. Across the theater, Brian stood back at his post, arms folded, eyes flickering between faces. A fellow usher leaned in and said something to him. Brian didn't respond at first, but his jaw twitched slightly. Maybe it was the supervisor's correction that still lingered in his mind. Maybe it was the weight of being wrong in front of someone he hadn't expected to stand their ground. But his mind wasn't in the music, nor in the drama to come. The earlier encounter at the entrance hadn't settled. It buzzed at the edge of his focus, like static. Just as he shifted to adjust his sleeve, a figure moved purposefully down the aisle. It was the usher from earlier, Brian, his posture stiffer than before, jaw tight with something unreadable. He stopped at the edge of Elijah's row and called out in a tone that didn't match the hushed elegance of the theater. "Sir, I need you to come with me, now." Heads turned. A ripple moved across the audience. Elijah stood slowly, his movement graceful but wary. "May I ask why?" he said, but Brian didn't answer directly. "There's a concern with your seat," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Security appeared moments later. 2 men in black polos and earpieces, summoned without further confirmation. One positioned himself at the far end of the aisle, the other behind Elijah's row, forming an unspoken pressure to move. The audience, now alert, shifted in their seats, some watching openly, others pretending not to. Elijah held out his ticket again. "I've already been verified," he said. "Check with your supervisor." Brian shook his head. "We've received a report that someone may be seated here without proper authorization." His voice was flat, rehearsed, and completely detached from the facts. Elijah, now standing fully, looked to the supervisor station in the back. Teresa was not present. He was alone. As the guard stepped in, one of them touched his earpiece, then motioned silently. Elijah complied, adjusting his coat and stepping into the aisle. The escort began. No one said a word. The walk down the aisle was long, lined by silence and staring eyes. At the back of the house, near the velvet exit curtain, the usher paused. The security team held their position while Brian whispered briefly into a small radio. A voice crackled back, unintelligible from Elijah's distance. Then came the judgment. "You'll need to wait outside while we clarify this," Brian said, not even attempting a softer tone. Elijah's mouth parted slightly, but he said nothing. He turned toward the exit, passing beneath the glowing red letters above the emergency door. The moment he stepped into the side corridor, the murmur resumed behind him like a curtain falling. Outside the auditorium, a cool draft of air greeted him. The hallway was quiet except for the buzz of distant lights. A janitor pushing a mop paused at the sight of him, but said nothing. Elijah leaned against the wall, phone in hand, staring down at the screen without typing. Behind him, the muffled sounds of the audience settled again. He remained there, silent, for 10 full minutes. Back inside the platinum tier, the usher resumed his post as if nothing had happened. Within moments, a couple arrived late, Caucasian, dressed in beige formal wear, breathless from rushing. Their tickets were half-wrinkled, pulled hurriedly from a pocket. Brian greeted them warmly, scanned only one, and unclipped the velvet rope with a fluid gesture. No ID requested, no verification. He offered them water and even walked them down the aisle to ensure they found their seats with ease. Several guests from earlier, still fresh from witnessing Elijah's public removal, exchanged confused glances. One woman whispered something to her companion, who frowned and looked toward the usher, then shook his head and looked away. No one questioned Brian. The show was about to begin. The conductor emerged to light applause. The lights dimmed, and the first notes of the overture began to rise. Outside, Elijah remained where he stood. No one had returned to explain. No message had arrived. No one offered clarity. His seat, legally reserved, personally assigned, was now occupied by someone else. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Every part of this felt familiar. But familiarity didn't dull the edge. It didn't make it right. He opened his eyes, straightened his jacket, and began walking away from the side hall through the empty lobby, past the bar that had closed, toward the grand glass doors that framed the entrance. The world beyond the glass was colder, darker. There had been no shouting, no arguments, only quiet decisions made behind closed lips and blank expressions. That kind of exclusion was harder to fight, because it wore the face of policy, not prejudice. Elijah exhaled and turned back toward the building, unwilling to let the night end on their terms. As he re-entered through the service corridor, he approached a different desk near the back office, where a junior staffer looked up from a clipboard. Elijah spoke calmly, professionally, and handed over his ticket again. "I'm requesting to be reseated," he said. "I'll wait as long as I need." The staffer blinked, unsure how to respond, but radioed for a floor manager without further delay. Within minutes, a man in a dark vest and name tag reading Assistant Operations Manager appeared. His name was Patrick. He had the look of someone trained to defuse, not resolve. Patrick took Elijah's ticket, glanced over it quickly, and said, "Follow me." There was no apology, no explanation, no attempt to reference the earlier error. They walked together down a long hallway that bypassed the main lobby and led directly to the orchestra entrance, the kind usually reserved for tech staff or late arrivals needing quiet access. Elijah said nothing, his footsteps deliberate. Patrick stopped near the bottom left stairwell, where the sound booth hummed behind a closed panel, and pointed to an isolated row of side seating. Half a dozen chairs tucked between the emergency exit and a stack of folder risers. "One of these is open," he said. Elijah looked at it for a long moment. It was dusty. The upholstery was frayed. It didn't match the rest of the house. But he nodded and took the seat, placing his coat across his lap like armor. From above, the stage lights cast a pale glow across the side section, not enough to illuminate faces, but enough to show who sat where. Elijah's new position offered a crooked view of the stage, blocked partially by a column and the edge of the curtain rigging. But he didn't look away. He leaned back and settled in, posture straight, breath calm. The usher had disappeared, but a different employee, someone younger, walked past moments later and did a double take. Elijah caught his glance. There was a flicker of recognition, followed by something else, confusion or regret, perhaps. But the young man didn't stop. He kept walking. A few rows ahead, a pair of staffers whispered to each other, eyes flicking toward Elijah before they shook with laughter. One of them mimed a sweeping gesture toward the rear seats. Elijah didn't flinch. He had seen the performance before. He just hadn't expected to be cast in it tonight. Backstage, the actors prepared for the second act. The stage manager's voice echoed through the comms, and the curtain crew took their places. The audience in the main house was none the wiser to the quiet insult playing out offstage. Elijah pulled his phone from his jacket and opened a secure app, typing in a string of commands and selecting a contact labeled Ops Oversight. He hesitated a second before hitting send. The message was brief, almost clinical. Internal review requested. Discrepancy in guest treatment at Grand Theater. Tier access denied despite verification. Submit log. As the message vanished into encryption, Elijah pocketed the phone and looked ahead. The curtain began to rise once again. The music swelled. The actors moved into position. And, in a row meant to be forgotten, a man watched, not just the show, but the system around it. Above the stage, the house manager, Teresa, had finally returned to her position. From her booth overlooking the crowd, she scanned the room with a pair of small field glasses, checking that each seat was filled. When her eyes reached the side aisle, they froze. She leaned forward, squinting, then flipped a page in her attendance manifest. Her lips tightened. She lifted her headset and asked someone to confirm the reseating order for the displaced platinum guest. The response that crackled back was vague. Miscommunication. Already handled. Request closed. Teresa said nothing further, but her pen paused in the air. She made a small mark in the margin beside Elijah's name. Most quickly looked away. The house lights lifted slightly, casting a warm yellow across the velvet sea of chairs. Intermission had begun. Patrons rose, stretched, filed out toward the lobby for wine and conversation. Elijah stood and moved with them, his steps unhurried, his gaze calm. Near the concession bar, a cluster of employees had gathered behind the counter, dressed in crisp uniforms, chatting and laughing as they filled glasses with sparkling drinks. Elijah waited his turn, standing behind an elderly woman and a young couple. His presence was noticeable. but not acknowledged. The woman in front of him ordered her drink and moved aside. The couple received theirs next, smiling as they thanked the attendant and stepped away. Elijah stepped forward. The server glanced toward him, then turned to begin restocking cups. Another staffer appeared beside her, picked up an order tray, and engaged in light banter with a colleague nearby. Elijah remained quiet, hands folded, watching the interaction. Several more patrons arrived behind him. Without looking, the attendant began assisting them first, pouring, swiping cards, offering napkins. Elijah didn't react outwardly. He simply waited, the line shifting around him, the air growing thicker with unspoken tension. Finally, the attendant turned to him and said curtly, "What do you need?" Her tone was sharp, devoid of hospitality. Elijah responded evenly, "1 glass of still water." She nodded once and poured it without comment, placing it on the counter with a soft thud, then turned to the next guest without waiting for thanks. Glass in hand, Elijah stepped aside. The hum of the crowd grew louder as the lobby filled with patrons. He stood near the far column, sipping slowly, observing more than participating. Across the room, a group of theater staff gathered near the mezzanine staircase. One of them, a woman with a headset and clipboard, stood facing the crowd and began addressing the Usher team nearby. Her voice carried more than she realized, or perhaps more than she cared to contain. "Apparently, someone from the wrong ticket bracket decided to go seat shopping," she said. "Make sure everyone's back where they actually belong before we restart." A few chuckles followed. No names were used, but no names were needed. Elijah's gaze lifted slightly, his expression unchanging. The implication, delivered so casually and publicly, hung in the air like perfume gone sour. It wasn't a policy update. It was theater, designed for an audience already tuned to one frequency. People nearby heard the comment. A man to Elijah's left glanced toward him, opened his mouth as if to say something, then looked away. A woman holding a program hesitated mid-sip, her brow furrowing, then lowered her cup and moved on. No one confronted the speaker. No one corrected her. The moment passed unchallenged, but it didn't vanish. Elijah returned his empty glass to the bin and slowly made his way back to the auditorium. As he walked through the dimmed hall, he passed the usher station where Brian now stood talking with a new staffer. Their conversation paused when Elijah passed, then resumed once he was gone. Every step of the journey back to his seat was marked by small signals, silent pauses, sidelong looks, whispered fragments of conversations that died when he came near. None of it was explicit. All of it was understood. When he reached his assigned chair near the service aisle, it had been adjusted slightly, pushed to the edge of the taped floor markings. Not obstructive, but just enough to make it feel misaligned, intentionally different. Elijah calmly adjusted it back into place before sitting. Around him, the music of idle chatter returned to a low hum. He sat still, breathing evenly, one leg crossed neatly over the other. In his pocket, his phone remained quiet, though 2 notifications blinked silently on its lock screen, updates from the corporate team he had alerted earlier. He didn't check them yet. He had no intention of responding until the final curtain dropped. His role tonight wasn't complete. He wasn't just witnessing injustice now. He was documenting it, step by step, word by word. Up in the control box, Teresa once again scanned the crowd. Her eyes found the far left section, where Elijah sat with measured stillness. She recognized the signs, not just the quiet resistance, but the gathering storm that came with it. She lowered her headset and made a single note in her log. Follow-up required. She didn't yet know what form that follow-up would take, but she knew enough to realize it wouldn't be quiet. Elijah, for his part, didn't look up. He didn't need to. Across the aisle from him, a family had taken their seats, a man, a woman, and a young boy no older than 6. The boy clutched a stuffed fox in one hand and a playbill in the other, his legs swinging above the carpeted floor. He looked around the vast room with wide eyes, full of wonder, until they settled on Elijah. The boy's gaze lingered longer than most. His expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. Then came the question, whispered too loud for secrecy. "Daddy, Why did that man get taken away from his seat earlier? The father's spine stiffened. He glanced around, clearly hoping no one else had heard. But they had. A woman in the next row shifted uncomfortably. An older couple nearby exchanged a glance. The mother leaned in and said something soft, too quiet to make out. But the boy's voice carried again. He didn't do anything wrong. Why did they move him? His innocence sliced through the room like a violin string breaking mid-note. No one answered him. The father offered a strained smile and turned his son's face back toward the stage, whispering something about staying quiet now that the show was starting. But the moment had landed. Around them, a dozen people now looked toward Elijah, not with suspicion, but with something else. Recognition. The silence that followed wasn't just part of the performance. It had a pulse, a conscience. In the balcony above, one of the youngest employees of the theater leaned forward, elbows resting on the railing. His name tag read Simon. He was a third-year intern, assigned mostly to usher rotation and cleanup duty. But he had seen what happened earlier. He had watched from the side hallway as Elijah was escorted out, had heard the tone in Brian's voice, had noticed how the tone changed when others passed. He hadn't said anything at the time. He didn't have the power. But something about the child's question made the injustice echo louder in his ears. He pulled out his phone, glanced once toward the senior ushers nearby, and opened the camera app. Keeping it low, he began recording discreetly, starting with the section where Elijah now sat alone. The footage showed nothing dramatic, but it didn't need to. Context was louder than action. Simon zoomed out and panned slowly across the main rows, the families, the couples, the elderly patrons, all seated in comfort and clustered together. Then he stopped the recording, saved it, and typed a short message to a friend who worked in digital media. His thumbs moved quickly. Something happened at work tonight. Not sure what they'll do about it, but I thought you should see. He attached the clip and hit send, slipping the phone back into his pocket before anyone noticed. Above him, the lights dimmed again. Below, the curtain began to rise for the final act. But Simon no longer saw a performance. He saw a system moving with masks on, pretending everything was fair when it had already been poisoned from the inside. And though he wasn't sure what to do next, he knew silence was no longer an option. On stage, the performers entered with elegance, voices clear and movements choreographed to near perfection. But in Elijah's mind, none of it registered. He watched the actors without seeing them, his thoughts 1,000 miles away from the plot. He was thinking of the boy, of the simplicity in that question, of how easily it cut past adult filters and excuses. Why did they move him? It echoed again and again, and it made something shift inside him. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a slim black card, the same one he had shown no one all night. The embossed letters on it were worn from use. He turned it over once in his palm, considering. Then, without ceremony, he tucked it back. Not yet. Not here. But soon. Down the row, two men in blazers whispered to each other, their expressions no longer passive. One of them had also seen the earlier exchange. He hadn't intervened, thinking it wasn't his place. But the boy's question made him replay it differently in his mind. He leaned toward his companion and asked, "You think something was wrong with the way they handled that?" The other man nodded slowly. "Yeah, I do. But who's going to say it first?" They both went quiet again, but something had cracked. The orchestra, trained for interruption, lowered their instruments, waiting for a cue. House lights flickered halfway up, casting the audience in pale confusion. On stage, actors froze in position, unsure whether to break character or hold. The director, watching from the booth above, gestured for the curtains to be drawn. A formal voice echoed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a temporary technical issue. Please remain seated while we resolve the matter." The announcement tried to sound calm, but beneath it lay tension, like a wire pulled taut. Elijah sat motionless. His seat, distant from the main house, gave him a full view of the disruption without being part of it. He didn't seem surprised. While others whispered in discomfort, glancing at phones or tapping their knees, Elijah reached into his coat and retrieved his device, not in frustration, but with deliberate timing. The glow from his screen illuminated his face just enough to show something subtle. Readiness. He scrolled briefly, opened a secure folder, and tapped on a contact simply labeled Executive. With a calm swipe, he hit call. The line picked up before the first ring completed. A voice answered with practiced precision. He responded with a few low phrases, each word clipped and direct. A pause followed, then he ended the call without ceremony. The phone disappeared back into his jacket. Around him, the audience remained in place, unaware that something outside the theater had just been set into motion. Outside on the street, headlights pierced the evening fog. Within minutes of Elijah's call, 3 black SUVs pulled up to the curb with synchronized grace. Their windows were tinted, their engines idling in silence. The theater's doorman blinked in confusion as a woman in a tailored navy suit stepped out of the lead vehicle. She moved quickly, but without rushing, her heels silent on the stone steps. 2 other figures flanked her, one with a clipboard, the other with a discreet earpiece. They walked past the red carpet, ignored the attendants, and headed directly to the private side entrance. Theater staff scrambled as the group entered unannounced, bypassing security as if they owned the building, which, as it turned out, was not far from the truth. The woman reached the inner hall, looked around once, and addressed the nearest employee in a calm but pointed voice. "Where is Mr. Jacob? Is he all right?" The name landed with force. Not everyone heard it, but for those close enough, it shifted the mood like wind changing before storm. Teresa, still watching from the control booth, leaned forward suddenly. Her headset crackled as she barked a quiet order to staff to hold positions and wait for instruction. In the shadows behind the stage, actors looked at one another, confused. Elijah, still seated, made no move. He didn't need to. His presence had already changed the flow of the evening. The woman and her team swept into the rear of the theater, scanning each row until her eyes locked on Elijah. She gave a sharp nod and approached him with quiet authority. A few guests noticed the interaction. Most still believed they were merely enduring a minor delay. But those in the wings, the ushers, the supervisors, the tech staff, began to feel a shift beneath their feet. Something was happening. From the balcony, Simon watched with wide eyes. He had no idea who the woman was, but he understood her power instantly. People moved for her without being told. Doors opened that had been locked all night. The clip he had sent earlier now felt like part of something much larger. He checked his messages. His contact had responded. "This needs to go live. You okay if I use your name?" Simon hesitated, then typed back, "No name, just the truth." He hit send and looked back down at the auditorium. The energy had changed, not in noise, but in silence, in the way staff straightened their backs, in how the smug expressions had vanished. It was the stillness before an impact, the inhale before the hammer drops. He felt it in his chest like thunder not yet heard. Near the main aisle, Brian, the usher who had denied Elijah entry earlier, stood stiffly. His radio buzzed, but he didn't respond. He saw the woman. He saw her walk directly to the man he had dismissed hours ago. And in that moment, his face paled. He looked at Teresa, who was already turning toward the back stairs. Then he looked at the crowd, which was no longer relaxed. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a slim pair of sunglasses, and removed them in one slow motion. What remained was no longer the anonymous man from earlier, no longer the seatless figure cast aside. This was someone different, and those who looked closely enough could see the weight in every inch of his stance. His name was Elijah Jacob, and he wasn't just a guest of the Grand Theater. He owned it. The reveal wasn't loud. There was no official announcement, no trumpet of recognition. It came in whispers, in the tightening of jaws, in the way a dozen staff members suddenly stood straighter. Someone in the balcony gasped softly. A woman in the mezzanine dropped her phone onto her lap. Down near the velvet rope, Brian took a half step back as realization sank in. Elijah Jacob, founder and CEO of Orion Entertainment Group, billionaire investor. The man who acquired this entire theater chain in a sweeping deal just 10 months ago. He had been featured in Forbes, Business Insider, Variety. His face had been printed across shareholder reports, but none of them had connected the dots. Why would they? Power rarely arrives loudly. It sits among shadows until provoked. And tonight it had been provoked fully. Teresa appeared beside the Usher post, breath caught somewhere between panic and discipline. Her headset hung around her neck now, her clipboard forgotten. She looked at Elijah with a dawning recognition that carried weight beyond policy. The corporate office hadn't sent a representative tonight. The corporate office had walked in himself. And every step that led to his public dismissal, his forced reseating, his humiliation, had been taken under their name, under their roof. Elijah said nothing as he made his way toward the center aisle. The woman in the navy suit followed behind him at a precise distance. Every eye in the room now watched. The actors had exited the stage. The lights remained stuck at half power. But the real show had already begun. From the mezzanine, Simon clutched his phone tighter. He read the name again in the message his journalist friend had just forwarded back to him. Elijah Jacob. That's who you filmed, man. You have any idea what you caught? Simon blinked. The quiet man in the side seat. The one they ignored. That was him. He leaned forward, barely aware of the show being canceled over the intercom. People stood from their seats slowly, murmuring among themselves. Some clapped, not for the performance, but for the moment unfolding in front of them. Others simply stared, caught between embarrassment and awe. The energy shifted again, from uncertainty to accountability. No one could pretend anymore. The truth was standing in the aisle, and it wore tailored wool and calm eyes. Brian, now frozen near the entrance, heard his name over the earpiece. The voice was trembling. Orders were unclear. Do nothing yet. Wait. A review is coming. He didn't need the radio to tell him what was about to happen. His gaze remained locked on Elijah, who now stood at the edge of the main stage. Teresa had stepped aside. Other managers lingered near the exit, unsure whether to approach or disappear. Elijah's assistant handed him a folder. He opened it, scanned its contents, and gave a single nod. There were no dramatics, no raised voice. But the look he offered the room was enough. It was a reminder of hierarchy, of oversight, of consequence. The audience didn't need a speech. The lesson had already been taught, and it would not be forgotten. A man from the back row stood slowly and began clapping. One by one, others joined, not out of courtesy, but respect. The applause built gradually, as if the audience finally understood the scene they had witnessed wasn't fiction. It was real, and the man who had been dismissed, ridiculed, displaced, was the one who owned every brick, every bulb, every chair they now sat on. Elijah didn't bow. He didn't gesture. He simply turned to the team who had followed him in and spoke lowly. The room was still adjusting to the weight of revelation when Elijah rose from his rightful seat again. The applause had quieted, but the echoes of it lingered in the walls. No one dared speak. The spotlight now belonged solely to him. Not the actors, not the ushers, not the managers hiding in the wings. Elijah stepped toward the front of the stage and addressed the assistant in the navy suit. She nodded, lifted a slim remote, and signaled toward the control booth. In response, a projector whirred to life near the ceiling. The white curtain behind the main stage lowered slowly, transforming into a temporary screen. The audience watched in confusion as the lights dimmed again, not for art, but for truth. What followed wasn't part of the playbill. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't fictional. It was footage, and it was real. The video began in silence. It opened with grainy footage of the front entrance hours earlier. Elijah handing over his ticket, Brian turning him away. The clip jumped forward, Elijah waiting as others were allowed in. It cut to the moment of public removal, the walk of shame, the forced seat downgrade. Every action, every word, captured by Simon's careful lens, and now broadcast for all to see. A gasp escaped from the left aisle as the mumbled insults and mocking tones echoed across the theater. A woman near the third row lowered her eyes. A man in the balcony covered his mouth with his hand. The atmosphere thickened into something heavier than silence, shame. Not just from the staff, but from the crowd that had watched and done nothing. The reel ended with a final freeze frame. Elijah seated alone in the far back row, eyes calm but isolated, like a king exiled from his own kingdom. Elijah waited a beat, then stepped forward again. His voice was calm even. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. Every syllable carried with it the weight of undeniable authority. What you just saw wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was a system functioning exactly as it was trained to. The audience remained frozen. He let the words settle. Bias isn't always loud. It whispers. It smiles. It dresses itself in uniforms and policies. And tonight it was exposed not by violence, but by silence. From behind him, Teresa lowered her eyes. Brian gripped the railing beside him, knuckles white. I built this company, Elijah continued, because I believed stories could transform people. But clearly, the one we've been telling inside these walls, off stage, needs to be rewritten. He turned slightly, facing the upper balcony where the technicians Saturday effective immediately. This branch of the Grand Theater will close for full operational audit. All leadership contracts are suspended pending review. Regional directors will report to a temporary board overseen directly by my executive office. Gasps rose again, not just from staff, but from senior figures seated throughout the house who had not expected this level of immediacy. If this culture exists here, Elijah said, it exists elsewhere. And if it does, we will find it. We will not excuse it. We will replace it. He paused, then looked directly toward the camera at the back of the room, recording the entire moment. To anyone watching this, know this is not performative. This is consequence. This is what happens when power forgets to serve. The screen behind him faded to black. The lights returned to their full brightness, but the theater felt dimmer somehow, like truth had drained the illusion from a space. Elijah stepped back from the stage and returned to the front row, sitting once again in silence. But now, no one looked down on him. No one questioned why he was there. He had reclaimed not just his seat, but the moral center of the institution. Teresa approached him quietly, her clipboard no longer in hand. She didn't speak. She just stood there, visibly rattled. From the audience, someone began clapping slowly. Then another. Soon the sound built, not theatrical, not celebratory, but acknowledging. A few even stood. But Elijah didn't move. He didn't smile. He simply nodded once toward Simon, seated in the balcony. A silent signal of gratitude passed without words. Simon's eyes widened. He had not expected that. A small vibration buzzed in his pocket. Another message from the journalist. Going live in 5. Headline. CEO shamed at his own theater. Exposes entire system in real time. Simon looked down at the man below, then typed one final reply. Send it. Let them see. Across the city. The video would begin to circulate before the next hour ended. But here, in the very theater where it all began, the shift had already started. Not just in policy, but in perception. People would leave changed. Not because of a script or a scene, but because reality had cut through the stage lights. Elijah remained still, but his silence was now full of power. And the story, once buried, was now carved into every corner of that building. The clip went live at exactly 9:07 p.m. By 9:12, it had already been shared over 3,000 times. By 9:30, it had crossed state lines, appearing on feeds from New York to San Francisco. Viewers didn't scroll past it, they watched it in full. They saw the usher turn Elijah away. They saw him stand alone while others passed freely. They heard the sharp tone. They witnessed the calculated humiliation. And then they saw the reversal, the exposure, the reckoning. The comments came in waves. Some were outraged. Others were embarrassed. Many confessed to recognizing similar behavior in places they worked or visited. Hashtags emerged. Articles were published before the final curtain even fell. And by morning, the name of the Grand Theater wasn't trending for its production, but for its prejudice. The backlash was swift, but it wasn't irrational. It was personal. It had been felt by too many for too long. Back at the corporate headquarters of Orion Entertainment Group, the internal review Elijah ordered was already underway. Teresa was relieved of her duties pending investigation. Brian was terminated on the spot. His badge deactivated, his access revoked. He left the building that night with his head down, passing through the same door he once blocked others from entering. But it didn't end there. A digital audit team combed through footage from other branches. They uncovered patterns, smaller incidents, never escalated, never reported. But now, each of them was a red flag. Every ignored complaint, every staff reassignment swept under the rug, came back under scrutiny. Region by region, location by location, the company began interviewing former employees, rewatching archived security tapes, reopening buried reports. What had once been tolerated quietly now carried consequences. The rot was deeper than expected. Elijah had known that. He just needed a spark to expose the fire. Across the city, theaters operated under new procedures by sunrise. Emergency memos were dispatched to all regional managers. Training programs were suspended indefinitely and replaced by mandatory restructuring seminars. Public statements were issued, signed personally by Elijah Jacob. In them, he didn't just apologize. He named the problem. He admitted failure. He outlined changes. And still, the public demanded more. Boycotts were announced. Review sites flooded with testimonies. Some were old stories, finally finding daylight. Others were new, triggered by the courage Elijah's stand had ignited. Activist groups picked up the case. Legal teams requested data. Media outlets ran specials analyzing the footage, dissecting the social dynamics at play. A single night had unraveled a carefully curated illusion of equality, and no one in leadership could ignore it now. A storm had come, and it demanded not just apologies, but justice. Simon's video became the benchmark for corporate exposure. He was contacted by journalists, human rights groups, even business ethics professors asking for permission to use the footage. At first, he declined interviews, preferring to remain anonymous. But eventually, he allowed his name to be credited. Quietly, he received a personal message from Elijah's office. "Thank you for your clarity, for your courage." The chain reaction that began in the balcony now rippled across an entire industry. Competitor companies reviewed their own practices out of fear they might be next. Elijah's firm received thousands of messages, not all positive. Some were defensive, others hostile. But overwhelmingly, they were from people who felt seen, heard, represented for the first time. He didn't respond to most. He didn't need to. His actions had spoken louder than statements ever could. Brian, sitting alone in a quiet apartment days later, watched the video again. Not to defend himself, not to relive it, but because he still didn't understand where he went wrong. He had followed the rule book, or at least what he thought it was. He had assumed. He had judged. He had laughed behind a customer's back. None of it had felt dramatic in the moment. It had felt normal. But now in replay, it looked different. It looked like cruelty. It looked like complicity. For the first time, he saw what others saw. And he didn't like it. He turned off the video. He sat in silence. Then he opened a blank document and began to write, not a complaint, not a defense, but something close to an apology. It wouldn't fix what had happened, but it was a start. A quiet first sentence on a page long overdue. Back at the theater, Elijah reviewed the latest audit results from a private meeting room. His face gave away little. His hands rested calmly on the table. Behind him, a screen displayed a web of data points, patterns of bias, staffing maps, exit interviews. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved. The executive team watched him nervously. He stood and addressed them without raising his voice. "This wasn't just a failure in training," he said. "It was a failure of culture. And culture starts with leadership. That means us." No one interrupted. No one disagreed. The new policies he proposed were radical, but necessary. Real oversight, anonymous reporting systems, diversity councils with actual authority, monthly rotation of leadership across regions to prevent stagnation. What was once a business would now become a model, not just for redemption, but for responsibility. 1 week later, the storm had settled into silence, but not forgetfulness. The city moved on, the headlines faded, but within the echo chambers of boardrooms and backstage corridors, something lingered. The name Elijah Jacob now meant more than wealth, it meant reckoning. Yet, amid the sweeping reforms and public praise, something unexpected happened. Brian returned, not to reclaim his job, not with bravado or excuses, but quietly, alone. He waited outside the Orion building for over an hour before security let him in. He didn't bring lawyers. He didn't prepare statements. He carried only a manila folder and something far heavier: remorse. When he sat across from Elijah, he didn't posture. His eyes were tired, his voice hoarse. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want to understand what I didn't see." Elijah didn't interrupt. He listened. Brian's story unfolded in fragments: memories of childhood, neighborhoods where difference was a threat, workplaces where laughter masked cruelty. He admitted things he hadn't known were wrong until they were replayed before millions. "I thought I was enforcing order," he confessed. "But all I was doing was protecting a wall that didn't need protection. I thought I belonged because I pushed others out." He paused, looked down, then added, "Now I don't know where I belong at all." Elijah studied him, silent. This was no PR stunt, no attempt at manipulation. Brian was unraveling in real time, not to gain pity, but because he had nowhere else to put the truth. And somehow, Elijah understood that. Because remorse, when real, has a tone no apology can fake. Because redemption, when earned, doesn't begin with a microphone, but with brokenness. Elijah stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the skyline. He remembered being that boy once, the one turned away, the one erased in real time. And now, the man who had erased him was seeking a line back into the light. Elijah returned to the table and said only one thing: "We don't offer jobs back, but we build new ones." Brian blinked. Elijah slid a folder across the table. Inside was a role: Cultural Systems Liaison. The mission was simple but transformative: travel to each branch, listen, learn, and teach what had never been taught before. Not rules, but awareness. Not quotas, but character. Brian said nothing, but his hands shook when he accepted the offer. It wasn't just employment. It was an invitation to unlearn, to rebuild, to face the mirror and still keep going. And maybe that was harder than any punishment. In the months that followed, Elijah's system didn't just recover, it evolved. Theaters once feared for their reputation now competed for change. Internal forums replaced memos. Staff were encouraged to share not what they knew, but what they had ignored. Old managers resigned. New leaders rose. And in that reshuffle, something beautiful emerged. Brian didn't hide from his past. He began each seminar with his own footage. He watched it with them, then looked them in the eye and said, "This is what I looked like when I didn't know better. Don't be me. Be better than me." Some resisted, others cried, but no one left unmoved. Because change spoken from a stage rarely lingers. But change modeled by a flawed man who chooses accountability, it roots deep. And as his tour expanded across states, so did the message. Not all villains stay villains. Some choose to change their lines mid-script. Simon, the intern whose camera had started it all, now worked in policy review. Elijah offered him a full-time position overseeing cultural transparency reports. Simon never sought credit, but he often walked the empty rows of old theaters at night, remembering what silence once looked like. And in one small town where a young usher hesitated before turning away a guest, Simon gently pulled him aside and reminded him, "Every seat matters. And so does who we choose to ignore." Elijah, meanwhile, kept moving, not in search of applause, but because justice, once started, cannot stand still. He visited high schools. He spoke to rooms that weren't filled with shareholders, but with future ushers, managers, leaders. And when asked what changed him most, he never mentioned the wealth or the power. He He said only this, "A moment where I could have stayed silent, but didn't." The end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. Which moment hit you the hardest? Was it the reveal, the public reckoning, or the chance for redemption? And where in the world are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective.